Riaan Botha, who is National Manager of Will Services at Absa Trust. He was in a week or two ago talking about wills. Now we want to focus today specifically with Riaan on trusts, and appropriate enough, he's from Absa Trust, so he's an expert in the field. Morning to you, Riaan. I think that the issue with the will is people think if you've got a will, then you're catered for, and when you die, well, everything just gets left to people. Not as easy as that always. What is the advantage of having a trust in addition to a will?
Dave, a trust is basically an arrangement whereby certain assets are handed over to a person or organization where they take charge of the assets for the benefit of the beneficiaries. It's not a separate legal entity such as a company. So they manage the assets for the beneficiaries. Trust basically started in the Middle Ages, where trust was given to a specific person to handle the assets of that person when he went off to war to go fight. So that's basically where trust started.
So it's literally trusting someone
Yes.
to look after your affairs?
Yes, it's a contract that you sign that's registered at the Magistrate of the Supreme Court, whereby certain rights and powers are given to a person to manage the assets on behalf of the beneficiary.
But why should you do that? Because if you have a will and you leave your, all your assets, say, to your wife or your children, why don't they just take over those assets?
We've got two different trusts. We've got an Vivos trust, which is a living trust that's set up upon during your lifetime, where you can put certain assets within that trust to protect it for the beneficiaries. And you can decide which assets go in there. That's a way of splitting your estate and freezing the value of your estate for estate duty purposes. Then on the other hand, we've got a testamentary trust that's set up in terms of your will, whereby certain assets go into that trust for the benefit of, for instance, minor children or specific organizations. So there's various benefits to.
Doesn't it also help, because when you die, your estate is frozen, so your bank accounts are frozen. They can't take your card, assuming they know your PIN number, and just continue to use your account. So isn't there an advantage with the trust with things like that?
Yes, a trust does not die. When you die, a trust is not affected at all, and it just carries on. So if you create wealth within the trust, then the funds in that trust can be utilized while the estate is being finalized.
Is it a complicated thing to do?
No, it's not. South Africans are under the impression that only the wealthy and the very complex can utilize trust, whereas anybody that's got the need for a trust can utilize.
Well, let's take your typical middle class, not very high net worth individuals. I think they have different issues. Not tax not being the least of them, and keeping things aside, as you said. So your average middle class, got some assets to hand on. What would this trust list look like? Who would be on it? How many people?
A typical family trust will be husband and wife as trustees and an independent person as the trustees, and the beneficiaries will be husband, wife, and all their lawful descendants. So the assets are protected for future generations. We've got trusts that were registered in the early 1900s that is still now active, where 4 generations have benefited out of that trust, and the funds are managed in such a way to provide for education, etc. You
would want, presumably, independent trustees. If you're talking about a family, you want 1 or 2 people from outside the family to bring an objective view, because we know, I mean, the cliche literature is full of it, fights over the wills, by, bitter fights within a family.
The reason for the independent trustee is for the trust not to be seen as your alter ego. If the trust is seen as your alter ego, SARS and the Magistrate of the High Court might scrap the trust, and those assets will form part of your estate. So in order to have the independent person on there and manage the assets on behalf of the beneficiaries, they've got a fiduciary duty to do that for the beneficiaries.
Looking at the high net worth individuals I mentioned a moment ago, different rules for them, presumably. What typically would you advise?
My suggestion is any person that has the ability to grow a big estate, to rather as soon as possible set up a trust and start building wealth within the trust. When you are at the age of 50 or 60 and you've got this massive estate, to then transfer assets into a trust is going to cost you too much money. So setting up a trust at the right time is definitely the way to go.
How much does it cost?
A trust is not expensive.
But you said if you have a big estate to try, and then why does that cost money?
Because then you pay transfer duty, capital gains taxes, etc. will become applicable. Whereas if you start off with buying assets directly into the trust, there's no tax implications.
So how much does the normal family trust cost?
Normal family trust costs about 4,000 Rand to set up, and then you look at an annual fee depending on the complexity of the trust. It ranges from between 2,000 and 10,000 Rand a year. So it's not an expensive vehicle to use.
What sort of market is it? And presumably institutions like yours, Absa, and your competitors at other banks, I mean, how many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of trusts are there in the country?
We've got hundreds of thousands at Absa. Most of them are testamentary trusts set up in terms of your will, whereby assets are protected for beneficiaries. And they're managed in such a way that the assets are not squandered. Because most people build up a fairly substantial estate and they want to make sure that their families are taken care of. And if you look at the Vivos Trust side, that is a personal aspect that every person will look at from a different angle. So managing those assets, whether it be properties, business interests, investments, those can all be housed within the trust itself.
Another aspect which we haven't mentioned is if both parents in a family die at the same time, which can happen,
yes,
then you need a very careful trust arrangement to ensure the interests of the children, especially if they're minor children, are looked after.
Yeah, that's a typical testamentary trust, whereby you can stipulate in your will that, for instance, at the age of 25, the remaining capital in that trust should be paid out to the beneficiaries. But while they're under the age of 25, income will be paid out for educational fees, university fees, should need be a car to be bought, etc. So it's a nice way of protecting the assets within the family.
Interesting.